Good morning. Welcome to Coffee and Conversation. I'm Ava Loy Lanning. I'm the Executive Director of NewStory Center, and we are here in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month to talk about the issue of domestic violence in Rutland County, and how we can address this issue and better support victims of domestic violence and help them transition away from violence to a life of safety and a life of happiness and health. I would like to welcome everyone here and give you a little bit of information about NewStory if you're not familiar with us. NewStory Center was formerly the Rutland County Women's Network and Shelter. We changed our name just about a year ago to recognize the fact that we work with all people in Rutland County who are experiencing domestic violence. We work with women and men as well as their dependent children. We are a direct service provider. We provide emergency shelter, housing, and advocacy services for those in need who are fleeing domestic violence. We also have supportive services and systems advocacy, and we are here for those in the community that need us. We're also here for our partners in the community that need our assistance, want our help in educating their staff or working with them to address the issue of domestic violence. And we are very pleased to be here this morning with a wonderful panel of people who I'll introduce to you in just a minute. I would like to thank our staff who is here, and would like to say to anyone that is here in our audience today that some of the conversation could potentially trigger for you any past trauma that you may have had, and if it does and you need support, all of our staff is here to support you. If you need to step out of the room, we completely understand, and we are here to help you with that. As well as anyone who may be watching the program today, if anything that we're talking about is triggering for you, or something in the conversation makes you think that you want to speak to an advocate at NewStory Center, our crisis hotline number is available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it will be on the bottom of the screen. Please give us a call, and there's an advocate available to speak with you anytime. We're going to hold our questions till the end today, and we will have time for questions for our panelists. If there's anything that you would like to ask anonymously, we also have paper available for you to write down your question, and it'll be read to us by one of the staff members, and we can get those questions to our panelists. And so I'd like to start and give the introductions for our panel today, who are all friends of NewStory Center, and we are so glad to have them here, all doing really important work to address the issue of domestic violence, and I'm excited to hear what everybody has to say. First, we have Rose Kennedy, who is our Rutland County State's Attorney. Rose has been our State's Attorney since 2014. She took office in 2015. She was elected in 2014, took office in 2015. Her office has 6 deputies and 2 victims advocates, one of which is here with us today. She prosecutes the majority of all crimes in the county, ranging from retail theft and property crimes to aggravated assaults, sexual assaults, and homicide. Rose is originally from Pittsburgh. She met her husband, John, who is a native Rutlander, in Washington, D.C., where she went to college and law school, and he convinced her to relocate to Vermont, and we are awfully happy that she did. They've lived in Vermont since '98, and Rose has been a prosecutor since '99. She started her career as a deputy state's attorney in Chittenden County, and she was assigned to the Unit for Special Investigations, was tasked with prosecuting all of the Chittenden County sexual assaults and severe child abuse cases. So welcome, Rose. Thank you for coming. Thank you. We also have Naomi Ross with us. Naomi's been a victim's advocate with the Rutland County State's Attorney's Office for 6 years. She graduated in 2010 from Castleton State College with a Bachelor's of Social Work, and will complete her Master's of Social Work from the University of New England in September. Congratulations on that. That's very exciting. Naomi is a fierce advocate for victims, and all of us on our staff can attest to that. And she's a fierce advocate for victims of violence in Rutland County, and recently received the state award, State Advocate Award from for the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services. Congratulations on that. That is a huge honor. We have Commander Greg Sheldon with us, Greg's in his 18th year with the Rutland City Police Department. He's held the ranks of patrolman, corporal, patrol sergeant, staff operations sergeant, and community response team sergeant. Apparently they couldn't find where to put Greg, but now he's commander, and it's great. He holds the rank of patrol commander, where he oversees the department's uniform patrol division and communication and dispatch center, some of the very first people who come in contact with victims of domestic violence, and we're very happy to have Greg in that position. Commander Sheldon instructs fair and impartial policing and eyewitness identification and supervises the department's crisis and hostage negotiation unit. Commander Sheldon received his bachelor's degree from Johnson State College and Master's of Science in Education and Leadership from Champlain College in Burlington. And so welcome, Greg. Thank you for being with us. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Jess Ellis. Jess is the program director at NewStory Center. She has been with us first starting in the role of systems advocate and has recently moved into the program director role. Jess came to us from the Parent-Child Center. She has a long history of advocacy and working with families in this community to make sure that they are healthy, they're getting what they need, that their children are healthy. And Jess is a mom and a fierce advocate and a pleasure to work with and have on our staff. So I'm glad that Jess is with us this morning. So I'd like to open it up to everybody. I have a few questions for us to help us move things along. But the first question I want to ask, just from your perspective, is what resources does our community have in place to respond to domestic violence?
I guess I'll go first. First of all, let me say thank you very much, Eveloy, for hosting an event like this. I think it's really important for the community to have conversations around domestic violence, and thank you for all the people that showed up. Also, thank you for the good work that your organization does in the community, and I think when you're talking about resources in Rutland County, the NewStory Center has to be top of the list. It's crucial that you are a part of this community and that you provide the resources that you do to victims, survivors, people that want sort of questions answered. Beyond what you're doing at NewStory Center, the resources that we have in Rutland County largely focus on law enforcement. That's sort of the first point of contact sometimes. Not necessarily from the survivor themselves, but people who might be concerned will sort of reach out to police and say, what should I do, or what do you think about this? And so what's important to realize is that we all sort of communicate pretty well in Rutland County. If one agency is dealing with something and the person might live in another town, the chiefs or the patrol will talk to each other and communicate. My office at the state's attorney's office has a dedicated domestic violence investigator. I'm grateful for Chief Kilcullen and the Rutland City Police Department for providing me an assigned investigator who only specializes in these types of cases, so that when cases come in through patrol at night, there's follow-up with that domestic violence investigator who can sort of dig a little bit deeper into the relationship or the context of the assault that might have occurred in the middle of the night before. And then we also have victim advocates in our office. We have a dedicated domestic violence prosecutor who specializes in prosecuting these cases. We work closely with other agencies like the Department of Children and Families. If children have been witnesses or have been the victims themselves, we work closely with them on sort of making sure there's a plan in place to keep them safe, or if there's counseling needs. I think Naomi can sort of address how she refers people out to other places as well, but that's sort of the beginnings of the process and the resources.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, so we as victim advocates work with lots of different community partners, including NewStory very heavily with domestic violence. We work with agencies that address housing, Department of Children and Families, to support families with children. We work with the Center for Crime Victim Services. They're a statewide organization, but we refer victims there. Any type of agency that may be applicable with someone who is struggling with domestic violence, we try to refer to. And that might not be directly related to domestic violence, but it might be related to housing. Somebody may have an issue with their apartment or their home. So we try to work with a lot of different community partners to address those things. We work with police, NewStory, as I said, and we try to just hook people up with any type of community resource that we have, whether it be around here or statewide.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a whole lot more to add. What I will throw out there is the lethality form that we use now. We call it the LAP form. We do that on scenes for domestic violence scenes to determine really the severity of it. And that form, well, that form dictates whether we call the hotline or not. So the officer will go down through this questionnaire, talk to the victim, and the answers that they give us and through their investigation will trigger the lethality form. That's one new, probably in the last 6 years that we've been doing that. The other thing that really has changed, I would say, over the last 5 or 6 years also is the course of conduct interviewing. And no longer is it, I don't want to hear about what happened 2 years ago, tell me what happened today. Now we want the whole big picture. And that, I think, is a huge process. A huge step forward for victims and for prosecuting. Then you have a bigger picture to show the jury or the judge. Overall, there's a lot of things you can talk about on scenes and what we do. The biggest thing is the lethality form and the course of conduct. The resources afterwards, I think, are the key. Not just housing, but what is this victim going to do for food? A lot of things we don't think about. What's this victim going to do for childcare? It goes beyond their arrest, which I think is a big aha moment for law enforcement. Our job was always to arrest, and our job was to make sure the victim was safe and turn him over to you folks. But now, through you folks in the Vision Center and all the partners we have, we now understand there's much more to this process than just making an arrest. Yeah, that's part of our process. That's our first step, is safety and making the appropriate arrest. But what is this victim going to do 2 weeks from now, 2 years from now? What can we do to help her, to keep her away from this permanently? So.
Good morning.
Jess, good morning.
So first of all, I think that's a good start to the menu of services. I think what's important to remember is each person comes to us at NewStory Center as an individual, and they know their situation best and what their needs are. But sometimes people are overwhelmed and they're not really sure. And so we start assessing at the time of intake, that first contact, sort of what might be good information or resources to offer, but we don't make any referrals or any, we don't make anyone participate in any services that they don't choose to participate in. And then working with that client as the driver of the bus, we sort of start picking apart, and our role as staff at NewStory is to kind of give all of the options, give all of the information. Someone might want to just safety plan with us and stay in that relationship and do so as safely as possible. Someone might be ready to leave right now. Whether they want to stay in Rutland County, this is where their roots are, or they want to go somewhere else in Vermont or out of the county or state, we really try to meet that person where they are. The folks sitting here with me at the table are some of my probably most commonly used resources for brainstorming. Want to kind of reiterate what Naomi said in that it's kind of like you take a rock and drop it into a pond. And so that's the DV, but there's ripples that just keep going. So whether it's food or whatever that need is, we're going to do our best to find a resource that will meet that need.
That's great. I think that resources, when we think of resources, we often think of social service resources like NewStory Center or Homeless Prevention Center or Disability Rights or any of those organizations, but we don't often think of the justice system, the legal system, as a resource for victims. And we've seen how powerfully impacted that victims can be and how empowered they can be by having a positive interaction with the officer that responds to the scene, or being able to be in the courtroom and tell their story and be listened to by a room full of people or a judge, have an attorney present, those kinds of things. It's an incredibly powerful resource for people, and I hope that the community thinks broadly when they're thinking in terms of resources, that it's not, that it's not a that calling law enforcement is not a last resort. Calling law enforcement is a very valuable resource for the people we serve and for our entire community. So I'm very appreciative of that, and very appreciative of our community partners in the social service world, because none of us can do this work in a vacuum. And so it's really important that we're all on the same page and working together. Yes.
To that point, I think people should be aware that if they call law enforcement, they're not going to get a cookie cutter response. We have had folks who have called law enforcement because they were scared for their own safety, but were not quite ready to tell their story. Didn't quite want to report all the violence, but wanted the police to be aware that they thought they might not be safe. And that traditionally has put law enforcement in a conflict, because their job is to keep people safe and make arrests. But we have sort of taken an approach since I've taken office to sort of work with the person and go at their speed. So we've had a few cases where the person truly was in danger, but they weren't ready to talk, and we just sort of did regular check-ins with them and made sure they were okay. And thankfully, after several months, this one case I'm thinking of, the person was ready to tell their story, and it did involve a criminal case and did involve a conviction. But I think domestic violence can run the gamut, and so calling law enforcement, people should realize, isn't going to be one response. It's going to be, like Jess said, we're going to look at each individual case on its own and sort of figure out what the best course of action is. And sometimes what we hear from victims or survivors is that they've tried to solve some problems on their own for a long time, and it didn't work, and so that's why they finally have called the police.
Right. That's right.
I hear that incredibly often, actually, in working with victims and survivors. Totally just lost my train of thought. It's not coming back to me.
Okay.
I apologize.
Well, if it does, we'll
right.
come back. All right. So I know at NewStory Center in the last year, we worked with over 600 victims and their children, primary victims and their children, in a variety of capacities. So those were not all people who were immediately fleeing. They were people who had called our hotline, who may have stopped by for food, who we've been working with for a long period of time. And but I'm wondering, from what you see, and maybe we'll start with Greg on this one, how prevalent is the issue of domestic violence in our Rutland County community?
Well, it's an interesting fact, because for about 4 years, we saw a decline in many of our crimes. One area that went up for us was aggravated assaults. And included in that aggravated assaults is domestic assaults. We are this year seeing a slight reduction. So the trend is trending down. Now, we have attributed the uptick over the last 4 years in the confidence of the victims to call police, the confidence in the community, legitimacy within the community, with victims of crime in general. So when our numbers went up, we felt really it came down to victims trusting us more. And we couldn't put our finger on anything else. Why that was the one area going up while all other crime was dropping. So I would say the legitimacy of the police department in the eyes of the victims is what's really driving that number now up. Now it's coming back down, because I think there's accountability in some areas, and that's thanks to Rose's office as well, and the prosecution of the offenders. Because these people, if they leave one victim, they'll do it again. So it's not just about finding the victim all the services they need, but it's also about making sure the offenders are held accountable. So I think the combined effort of our legitimacy in Rose's office and legitimacy of her office in the prosecution is helping. So.
Wonderful. Rose, is there a coordinated effort to look at maybe the most violent offenders, or a coordinated effort to address the issue that's happening in our community.
So yes, but I first want to
Okay.
answer your other question, which is, I think this crime is incredibly hard to quantify because this crime happens behind closed doors, and it's not a crime that people really want to report. It's awfully demeaning to admit that the person you love most in this world has hurt you. And so I don't know that we will ever get an accurate number of what actually is happening in our community. All we have is what's reported to us, and I hope victims, survivors have confidence in us. And you know, what I've tried to do in the domestic violence front when I took office was understand how complicated it is, understand that there are so many emotions and feelings that go through a victim's head when they make that phone call. Understand that we represent the state, and we have an obligation to keep people safe. And you know, sort of pairing that obligation with somebody who may want to stay in a relationship that we might view as very dangerous. That's not an easy path to navigate. It's something that we struggle with on every case, and trying to find that right balance between, you know, how do we keep somebody that we really feel is in complete danger safe, but respecting their choices as well. So, you know, is there a concerted effort? Yes, in the sense that we give these cases a lot of attention. Probably the day that the case comes in, Naomi or my other victim advocate is on the phone with the victim asking them what's going on, how are you doing, is there anything you need immediately? We try within 30 days to do a face-to-face conversation between the prosecutor that's going to handle the case, the victim advocate, and the victim, and sometimes law enforcement if there's more information to be gathered. We stay in constant communication up until the point that they don't want it, you know. So there's that, and I think there's also a lot of communication about, you know, how should we resolve this case? Is that really the best thing for you? Is it the best thing for the kids? So on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I would just reiterate, it is an underreported and hidden crime. If I broke into your house, you would call the police every single time. If you're the person that's supposed to love me and protect me and is paying my electric bill, and maybe I have children with special needs that I don't want to uproot from my home, from their home, I think that if you don't know someone in your life that's experienced either past or present domestic violence, they probably aren't feeling comfortable enough to tell you that. So,
thank you. Thank you for saying that. I think it is important to note when I talk about the numbers of people we serve, they're going to look different than the numbers in the county, because we do hear from people who we will hear from multiple times often before they're ever ready to communicate with law enforcement or reach out to law enforcement, and in some cases they never are ready. They want to be able to safely leave their abuser and move on with their lives, and there's no contact with law enforcement. And so those numbers, you know, our numbers are always going to be higher. But while we can say, I think every one of us would love to say that we will live in a community that is completely free of violence. The reality is that we know that people are experiencing violence in their home, and we want them to be safe, feel safe to reach out in whatever manner is the most comfortable for them, because there are resources available for them. What would you say, any of you, and this is for everybody on the panel, what do you think are the biggest social and economic impacts of domestic violence on our community? Because this isn't a personal issue. It's not a private issue. It's a public concern. And so what would you say is the biggest concern for our community?
I've been a little quiet. So, you know, when I am working with victims of domestic violence, I'm seeing a whole host of things. I'm seeing an economic struggle. If the abuser was the only income earner, I'm seeing lost wages. I'm seeing time that people are spending trying to locate resources and trying to kind of pick their life back up together. You know, I'm seeing a ripple effect into families. Sometimes it tears families apart. Sometimes families don't like to see people leaving their husband of 20 years because it's not acceptable. So I'm seeing a whole host of effects that people are experiencing. Not only like the socioeconomic stuff, but just internally, people struggle with their mental health and their physical well-being after assaults like this. And I think that absolutely affects our entire community. People feel like they are not ready to go back to work, or they're missing a lot of time from work. They're potentially risking their jobs. Childcare is potentially suffering. This crime doesn't only impact one person or one little family unit, but it can affect neighborhoods. Neighbors can be concerned and take time out of their lives to try to protect their neighbors. And families sometimes spend a lot of time trying to support their family member going through this. So it's not only the effects of on one person, but it can be effects on children. You know, children can really experience a lot of trauma from these types of events, and are experiencing their own struggles. So that's what I'm personally seeing, and I think probably it's very similar with my panel members. But I don't know, Greg, what are you seeing?
That was a setup. You know, nobody wants to see a police car on their street. No one wants to see 4 police cars show up on the street with lights and sirens going at any time of the day, or even, you know, especially at 2 in the morning. Domestic violence, or maybe we should, in our world, we divide it out between domestic violence and IPV, intimate partner violence, because domestic violence can be any household member. Right. So intimate partner violence is what we really are worried about, because that is typically what leads to more serious injuries or homicides. So nobody wants to see us show up. They're not a pretty scene sometimes. So yeah, when we show up on a scene and have to, you know, let's face it, not everybody wants to go with us willingly. So when we are arguing and fighting with somebody on the street to get them in the handcuffs or get them in the cruiser, and who wants to see that on the street? Next thing you know, people are going, well, they've been here 4 times, why aren't they doing something about this? Legitimacy of the police department drops when that happens. And let's face it, who wants to live in that community? All of a sudden, people start thinking, do I want to live here? Is my street safe? So it affects quality of life. It affects values of homes. Really, any kind of crime does, especially the nasty ones, such as domestic violence, the ones that can be, you know, violent. Right. Nobody knows what goes on in that house in many cases. They don't know why we're there. A lot of times our calls come in from neighbors who say, we hear screaming and yelling and people smashing, you know, things in the house. Somebody's getting hurt. It's not always the victim themselves that calls us. So, yeah, that's a trauma on the neighbor. That's a trauma on the neighborhood. It's hard to come back from that sometimes. But again, it's the community outreach that, for the victim, but as well for the whole community that we need to worry about. So,
great.
Jess?
Greg. Looking, you know, specifically from my role through the DV lens, I think we see a level of social isolation that perhaps you guys are seeing, but not seeing as directly, because that's why someone's come to us. That's what they're there to disclose. And when you're safety planning and you're looking at someone who's lost everything, they have nothing but the clothes on their back and the clothes on their child's back. You know, I often will be safety planning. You know, who do you have in Rutland County for your, you know, social supports, agency supports, concrete supports like us are great, but who do you have in your corner? Who can you call? And to see someone sit there and to really be thinking and to have nobody, not one single person that they could reach out to emotionally or for $10, you know, for gas money to get their newborn baby to a doctor's appointment. I think that it's really hard to show that social isolation to people outside of the role that we do, you know, and it makes me sad to think that someone can be so divided from their world, you know, and to not have anyone to turn to. And trying to rebuild those connections are so much harder than, you know, reaching out to Naomi and saying, hey, I've got a mom here that needs diapers. You got any ideas? I mean, we can do that stuff, but we can't give someone social support. And so I think the social isolation is incredible with domestic violence and sexual violence. I think transportation is a thing that we forget is a huge problem in our community for folks that don't have cars, that don't have $2 to get on the bus. So I think transportation, housing, and social lack of complete social supports is probably the most kind of despairing part of this work.
Thank you, Jess.
So I think the best way for me to answer this question is we recently had 2 cases sort of going through the system. Both happened to be women who were victims, and each of the women came from polar opposites on the socioeconomic scale, and yet both were sort of saying almost the exact words to us. Naomi and I were on the cases together, which was, "You're the first person to tell me I don't deserve this." I have friends who say just, put up with it because he's a nice guy. Both didn't know how they were going to continue paying rent to stay in the place that they wanted to stay because they had kids who loved the school district that they were in. So I think when you're talking about socio and societal and economic impact, I think like what Jess is saying, that there are a lot of people that when they do come forward have to rebuild that support network, and it's out there, and frankly through the system, I think they learned that they actually had a better support than they thought they did, and that they just needed to sort of talk about some of the issues, and I think forums like this help for people to understand what someone who's a victim or a survivor of domestic violence is going through and how they can be supportive for their friend.
I think that's such an excellent point, and it is an issue that I wanted us to touch on today, that for those people who are watching, who have known that they've got a friend or a family member in an abusive relationship for years, they have gotten compassion fatigue. It's the technical term we social workers use. They're worn out from trying to support, from worrying about their friend or family member, from saying the things that we all know. We can sit here on this panel and know that it is never helpful to say, "Why don't you just leave? I wouldn't put up with that. Why don't you just go? You can go. It's going to be easy. It'll be better." All of those things. We know that's not helpful. But if it was my sister or brother or mother or other family member or best friend, I can understand why people say that, because that's what they want for them. And but what is it that they can do to support? How do they support that person who is staying for whatever reason they're staying? They're staying because they don't want to take their kids out of school. They're staying because their abuser controls all of the finances. They're staying because they just bought a house, and where else would they go? They're staying because. There are so many reasons that people stay. So what do we say to that person who's in their life, who cares about them, who wants to support them, but doesn't know how? What do we say to them?
I think the most successful times where we've had really supportive family members or really supportive friends are the people that just listen, and they are always kind of an open ear to hear these things. It is incredibly frustrating when you want all of the best things for your friend or your family member, but sometimes people are just not ready for a variety of reasons: financial, just not being physically or emotionally ready to leave. I think just being there, even though it's very challenging, always being able to be that person for, that safe person for that individual. You don't have to be a trained social worker, a therapist to sort of do a little safety plan with your friend or family member of like, if you need to leave at 3 o'clock in the morning do you have a bag packed? Do you have your license, your identification? Do you have the things that you need, or where are those things that you can get quickly if you literally need to leave in the middle of the night? Being that person to provide, resources like NewStory Center, or the police, the local police department. Where is the local police department if you need to go there? And connecting that person with other people if you can, because it is incredibly trying and challenging to always be that person's backbone. But if you can just be open to listening, I think that's a very helpful step, because the person knows that, my friend Beth will always be there to either answer my text or call, and they'll probably know why if I'm calling in the middle of the night. And having frank conversations of like, I'm listening to what you're saying. It's sounding like you're in a very dangerous situation. Is there anything I can do to help connect you with NewStory Center or another agency that might be able to help? And if you're not ready, I respect that. That's fine. I think that's probably the best way to be really open to whatever your person might need.
So I'm going to answer that a little differently,
Okay.
which is, if we witness somebody stealing a purse from somebody, we would call the police, even though it didn't happen to us. So I think there are times when, if you're hearing or you're seeing bruises, even though it didn't happen to you, I think reaching out to law enforcement, reaching out to NewStory Center, and letting someone know that this might be going on. Again, I don't see that necessarily as a betrayal of a friendship, because it doesn't mean that everything's going to go full speed ahead with a prosecution, but it might be sort of connecting people to resources. Sometimes I think friends think it's not their business, but yet we would think other crimes are their business. So finding that balance, and I think if someone is confiding in you, from a prosecutor's perspective, it's helpful to keep good notes. When did they say it? What did you see that coincided with what they told you? Did you see a bruise? So that if they ever get to the point where they themselves are ready to tell what happened, there's a record of all this prior abuse from the friend's perspective who was told at the time.
Great. I would like to ask a follow-up to that, probably for you and for Greg, but if someone did that, if someone reached out, maybe they could hear the screaming at the neighbors, or they've seen the neighbor come out with bruises after they are hearing fights next door, and they make that call. What does the response to that call look like?
Do you want to start off?
Sure. It could be a welfare check, something simple as stopping by, knocking on the door and saying hi, talking to whoever answers the door to see what's going on. Some of the things that we sometimes see happening at the police station is friends or family showing up and wanting to report things, but not knowing what the next step is. Or saying, my friend doesn't want anything done right now, but I want it documented. And what better way to document it than in a police report, especially for Rose's office. So if the victim eventually does come forward and report it, or we get a call from a neighbor and we arrive and there's abuse going on and we make an arrest, then we have multiple accounts of, or documented accounts of what has been going on for the course of conduct type interviews. And I forgot the question.
It was what does the response look like if I make the call, if I make the call on behalf of my friend, because I'm at my wit's end and I don't know what else to do, and I
It could be basically for us it would be a welfare check unless we could prove something, unless we have probable cause enough to make an arrest. We'll go over and we'll do a welfare check based on reasonable suspicion or things like that, but it's kind of limited to what we can do, our scope.
Is there any fear in that instance of putting a potential victim in additional danger if law enforcement comes, knocks on the door to do a welfare check, and abuser is home, or potential abuser is home?
I don't know if it always has to be at the home, or a lot of times family members will tell us, well, he goes to work, so you need to go between these time periods. So it comes down to the officers interviewing of the family member and saying when's a good time.
Okay.
And when we either go to her work or his work, And yeah, we don't want to put the victim in any more danger than what, because obviously if an offender's there when we show up, they're going to want to know why we're there. And sometimes we can just, hey, the neighbor heard something, or hey, we got a call. And we try to, I don't want to say lie to somebody, but we do try to make it seem like we're not there just for that.
Okay.
And sometimes, whether that's good or bad, at least we know. And the family member can say, okay, because they always want to call back. They always want us to call them back and say, how was it? So it's important that we communicate back to them. Not really a good answer, I don't think.
No, it is a good answer. I think it gives people a clear picture of what would happen if they did make that call, if they felt like they had, they were at that point where they needed to make that call on behalf of someone.
Speaking to somebody, and they're, no, I'm fine, they're shaking. And they show physical signs of abuse or mental abuse. They are so shaken up, and no, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. We will, that's certainly not just walk away from that scene. We will, try to do a little more persuasion to get into the door and sit down and talk. Because obviously something clearly is going on.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we're rapidly approaching the end of our discussion. So I would love for each of you to take a moment and just let our audience know whatever it is that you would like them to know about the issue of domestic violence, how we can support victims, what we can do better as a community, what you need from all of us to respond to this issue more effectively. However you want to use your time, I'd love to hear from everybody.
So I kind of want to comment on the last question for my final comment. I think that it can be frustrating for those support people in our lives when they call our hotline and say, Susie needs your help, please call her. She really wants to hear from you, but she won't make the call. And we can't do that. We do feel that puts a victim at risk of harm if the abuser is around. What we could do, what we like to do, is meet people where they are. So if you are that support person, call our hotline, have a conversation, get some advice, some information from us. If you are the victim, call our hotline anonymously even. Find out, if this situation happened, what might you suggest?
You can reach out to us on Facebook.
Could reach out to us on Facebook. On our website, we have a Get Info, Get Help Now, email. There are lots of ways to reach us. You could call that hotline anonymously. We could talk about safe ways for you to have a window to talk with an advocate. So maybe you have a doctor's appointment, maybe you have a reach-up appointment, maybe you have another appointment in the community, and that's a safe time where you're alone to get some generic information. You don't have to do anything. We will not make you report. We will not report your information. Even if my buddy Greg shows up at the door and says he has a missing persons report for you, we cannot confirm or deny that we've worked with you either presently or in the past. And that goes beyond death for us. It is a very safe place to get information anonymously, to get information with your name. Whatever is right for you is what we want to do.
Good, Jess. Rick?
Well, the last thing I would like to say is, and I've said this before, when we were in a different panel discussion, is there needs to be more support and more funding for advocacy groups like yours, for Rosa's Office for Prosecution and Victims Advocates. There needs to be more support from the community and from the state level. Right now, there's not enough. They all say, well, why can't she just leave? Well, because you have 2 young kids and no place to live and no food. I don't know if everybody in society really understands that unless they live it or are in one of our roles and see it firsthand. We need more support for SIU and CFAC. We need more support for the victim advocacy groups like yours, for Rosa's Office, for anybody who provides support for these people. Without that, we can't provide anything. We can arrest all day long, but if they're not going to be put in jail and left in jail, the victims aren't safe. Victims need more than just safety. They need food. Safety is a lot more than just absence of violence. So they need food. They need shelter. They need somebody to talk to. And it is not well funded, in my opinion. And we've had this talk before, you and I, and it bothers me when I see certain things happening in our community and what the state spends money on, and then I see people scrambling in your groups or other groups to try to help people. And that's really, if you want to make society stronger and better, then it comes from the people. And that's where we need to start, the people first.
Great. Thank you.
I echo
Greg in talking about funding for this issue. Domestic violence is so prevalent, and while we can't quantify it, I think that it's a crime that is happening all over the place. I think education, not only for young youth going through school, for healthy relationships, I think education for even adults to understand the dynamics of domestic violence and why victims don't just leave the first time they're struck. For some people, that is a really foreign concept, right? A stranger strikes me on the street, of course I'm going to call the police, of course I'm going to do something about it. But my loved one in my home that I have 2 children with strikes me in the face, I'm probably going to think about it really carefully whether I report it, because there's other consequences that come rippling down when I do. So I think education for the community is really important. Forums like this are extremely important. Having the conversation all the time of how do we support victims of these crimes, how do we support the community to support victims of these crimes, I think is really vital. Funding is vital to do that, and I think continuing the conversation ongoing is also vital.
Thank you.
So I think I want to end sort of talking to people out there who may find themselves in a jury. You know, you are randomly selected in the county to be on the jury panels. And if you find yourself in such a situation, please understand that this is a crime. I actually had a defense attorney argue recently when we were talking about conditions of release, and the allegations was a domestic violence on a particular individual. The argument from the defense counsel was, well, he doesn't present a risk to the general public. The victim is a member of the general public, and they potentially are at risk. And, you know, please educate yourself on this crime, why people might report it late, why people might have a hard time leaving a situation, why people want to give their abuser a second chance, maybe a third chance, a fourth chance, because they love them and believe them when they say they're going to change and they won't ever hit them again. And please understand that we all have an obligation to make sure people are safe in their homes. You know, talking about the societal and economic repercussions of domestic violence, there are kids in a lot of these homes who might not be directly involved, but they're watching and they're learning, and you know, they will adopt behaviors that they see, and that could take generations to undo. So, you know, again, to the jurors out there, please understand the significance of this crime, and you know, if you're asked to be part of a panel in one of these cases, please take it seriously.
That's a great way to end this particular discussion by saying that there are a lot of layers to the onion that is domestic violence. It doesn't look the same in every case. It doesn't always involve physical abuse. It's psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. It is about power and control. And if you are in a relationship that you don't feel safe, please pick up the phone and call someone that you trust and talk to them about it. Call us at NewStory Center. Call law enforcement if you are afraid that you can't leave safely but you're ready to go. Call law enforcement to do that. They're a resource for you. And no one in our community should be living in a home where they feel unsafe. And that is the reason that we're here today. That's the reason that we recognize Domestic Violence Awareness Month. To get it out in the forefront, have us all talking about it, have us all recognizing that it happens in our community. There's nothing to be ashamed of, and there is support and there are helps for you, and it can look the way that you want it to look. We all, the community, everyone in this room, everyone on this panel, we want our friends and neighbors to be living a safe life in their home. And so we hope that if you're hearing this, that you will make that call and know that there are supports for you. So I would like at this time to open it up for questions from our audience, if anyone has any, and we'll be happy to continue our discussion. Yes, sir.
I've got a question.
Can you come up to the mic?
Yeah, I have a broad question because we're covering a lot of after-the-fact scenarios. I was wondering what happens if you actually look back in the history of the person, if there's something there that can be correctable, who's the aggressor. For example, I know a woman who was in a situation where her boyfriend came back from tour of duty overseas with PTSD and was ended up on drugs. And there's some side effects to the drugs, which, if it's not managed correctly, is bad news. And she woke up in the middle of the night from sleep with her boyfriend on top of her, choking her to death. And so she ended up having to leave the situation ultimately and move away. So do you have programs that address the PTSD issues, drugs, which may be part of an increase in some of the instabilities of both the family structure and the individual's mindsets, and alcohol, basically substance abuse programs that instead of litigation and incarceration, are there actually avenues and investigative programs which actually look backwards in the time frame of the individual's history who's the aggressor, trying to pinpoint potential problems that could be correctable with counseling and proper medical care? Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Absolutely. You know, when we are looking at an offender, we are trying to figure out what rehabilitative needs they have as well. We work closely with the Department of Corrections to sort of figure out they have, not only do they have domestic abuse or abuse counseling, they have anger management, mental health counseling, substance abuse screening and counseling. So, you know, all those are available to us, and there's different ways to sort of create, if it does come through the police and through our system, there's different ways to craft an agreement to get those services in place for the offender. Sometimes we're not aware, you know, of all of the issues. Defendants don't have to tell us, so we leave it. You know, primarily as a prosecutor, I'm getting my information from what the victim is telling me and what defense counsel wishes to share with me. So, you know, hopefully through those, we get a clearer picture of what might have precipitated the abuse and try to address those needs.
I think as a community, we're dedicated to helping each member of the community get the services that they might need. If someone was to come to me and say, listen, I think I've been unsafe in a relationship towards someone else, I would certainly, well, that's not necessarily what we do all day long, would help connect them to whatever services they thought they were needing. Unfortunately, that's not what I'm seeing in my line of work.
We also will have people call our hotline on occasion, and they will describe a scenario, much as you just described, that they have been in a relationship for a long time and something changed. Maybe there was a traumatic brain injury, or there's PTSD, somebody who's been deployed, something like that. And this person's personality and behavior has completely changed. And they're calling our hotline wanting to safety plan around how do I deal with this essentially new person in my life that hasn't always been there. And we will, as a part of that safety planning, give them resources that they can hopefully get their loved one to or help them access. And that is a way to keep them both safe. We also safety plan around that if it becomes so unsafe in the house, that while they want to help this person, there is no reason and that they should be unsafe in that process. And so we do have those conversations, and we do get those calls on occasion. Any other questions for our panelists?
Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm Jennifer Scott. I'm the president of College of St. Joseph. And first, I just wanted to say that and extend an open invitation if there is anything that the college can do for NewStory Center, if we have resources that would be helpful to you or those that are affiliated with you, please reach out to me because we would be happy to help. We are fortunate to have institutions of higher education in the immediate area that are outstanding, from Green Mountain College and Castleton University, Community College of Vermont, and College of St. Joseph. So my question is, what do you see as the role of higher education in the solution?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's multiple roles. One is to keep students safe, to assist law enforcement if a situation comes up and helping them investigate, providing support if someone has come forward, and you know, that hasn't always been the case, unfortunately. And I think the bigger role probably for universities, as you know, is to educate around this issue, and you know, that people should be safe in relationships, and on both sides, you know, everybody. But welcome, nice to meet you, and I think we certainly would love to have further conversations. My office would love to have further conversations with you about sort of how we go forward.
I think so many young people, when they go to college for the first time, they're also getting into their first serious relationships. And if they have not had good role models for what a relationship should look like, what a healthy relationship should look like in their lives, then it's difficult to know that when they start to form their own relationships, as Rose said earlier. And so the education piece is so key, and having these open conversations, being able to provide an environment that is safe for a student to come, to have somewhere to go to say, I'm in a relationship that doesn't quite feel right, or I'm not sure how I'm supposed to answer this question, or how I am supposed to, you know, many young people are in their first sexual relationships, and they don't know how to negotiate safe sex. They don't know how to have those conversations, creating that broader environment where they can feel safe to speak with anyone on campus, and ask those questions, talk those things through, not be told what to do or necessarily given advice, but listened to. I just think it's so important. And I also want to say that NewStory Center, we got our beginnings in our very beginning as Her Story House from the Sisters of St. Joseph. And we have a great friend in the College of St. Joe, and I'm so happy to meet you and so glad you're here. But I do think that our universities have a large role to play in helping young people successfully move on to healthy relationships throughout the rest of their lives.
Can I just?
Sure.
And we appreciate the welcome. I think we're always happy to come out and speak to classes or to student groups about the resources that we have. I know a lot of universities have on-campus resources, which are great. As we talked about earlier, not every solution is the right fit for every person. So sometimes us as a second line, as someone that you know is not going to be in your class tomorrow morning when you're calling, can be incredibly helpful. So.
And we are here to be a resource to the whole community, not just those experiencing domestic or sexual violence. So whenever you need us, come forward.
Hi. My name is Joanna, and I work for the Children's Integrated Services team for the Rutland County Parent-Child Center. I also did my internship with Rose and Naomi. I'm a BSW from Castleton University. My question is, having been a victim of domestic situations multiple times myself, the response to my reporting was empathetic from the city police level, but more of an accusatory sort of thing from the state level, because the stalking situation happened both in the city and in the town. So my question is, what kind of empathy training do officers of the law go through? I know a little bit about what the city police does, but as far as the state police, I was questioned like I was the problem. So I'm looking, if I had not had the training that I have and do what I do for work, I would not have continued to report so that there would be an eventual conviction. So for someone who does not have that kind of training, they're just going to give up because they're going to be made to feel like it's their fault. So can we talk a little bit about that sort of empathy training for officers of the law? Thank you.
I don't believe there's any empathy training. I'm not sure. I've read articles where they say you can train or teach empathy, and there's articles that say you can't. What I believe it comes down to is culture. Culture of your agency. You can have all the policies in the world, but culture trumps policy every time. So our culture is problem solving and community partnerships. So it comes down to the officer and the culture they're trained in and the culture they work in every day. I can't speak for the state. I don't know what they do for training. I'm sorry you went through that. I'm happy to hear that your experience with us was what I would hope it would be. But again, I don't think there's empathy training per se. We don't go through any ourselves. I think it's just a simple fact of our culture of our department is community partnerships, outreach. If the officer can't solve the problem, we'll pass it off to one of the partners that we have through the Vision Center. We've encouraged our officers to remember that we're victim-orientated and we're problem solvers. If nothing else, that's what we do. Only 18% or 17% of our call volume is crime in nature, so the rest of our calls, 83%, are quality of life issues and problems that we help the community members solve, or at least give them advice on where to go to help resolve their issues. So it comes down to culture. I can't say anything more than that. Culture and just the desire to put victims first.
So I would just say also, Joanna, I'm sorry that you went through that. Understand that when law enforcement take a complaint, they have a job to do, which is to investigate, and sometimes that does require a lot of questions. Sometimes officers are better at that than others. The State's Attorney's Office, NewStory Center, and Disability Rights Vermont, we try to put on joint trainings for local law enforcement to sort of talk about how you do that investigation while still being sensitive to issues. I go up to the police academy. I try to go up with each class and sort of have a conversation about while you have a job to do and while you need to investigate and while you need to make sure you have, your ducks in a row when you're presenting a case to us. Understand that someone is scared and traumatized, and there's a way to go about the investigation in a tactful way. So also getting feedback from folks like you is really helpful to know that there are places to still work on. So speaking up and letting us know is helpful. I don't think there's anyone at any of the police agencies in Rutland County that want to hear that someone had a bad interaction. It just might be a situation where we have to sort of train and educate someone in how they go about their job.
I think from our perspective, we also go to the academy. I know that there is domestic violence training that happens, sexual assault training that happens, but I believe that with empathy comes with understanding, and so being able to paint the broadest picture that we can of what is domestic violence, and that it doesn't always look the same, and that you're not always going to have a sympathetic victim. You're not always going to have someone, they may not be sobbing and asking for your help. They may be belligerent and telling you to leave them alone, and you may have an abuser that's very charming because it's in their best interest to be charming and to be as sympathetic as possible. Being able to have those conversations and have them over and over and over again helps with that understanding and that response. And I also am sorry that you had that response, and I know that many people over the years, it's gotten so much better over the years. I've been around a long time, but it's gotten so much better over the years. But there's still a lot of work to do, and it has to be conversation that's always happening. We can't just have it in October. We've got to be having it throughout the year.
And we do have a systems advocate at NewStory Center, so part of the work that we're always kind of doing is trying to affect change on all those ripples in the pond. And so, like Rose said, if we get feedback from folks on, challenging interactions also, we certainly can help that education piece and continue working as a team to make for better experiences.
Great.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for having this forum. I think it's so important to get the message out to victims that there is someone that they can go to. Having worked in the state's attorney's office for a number of years, I personally saw how difficult this situation can be when I've seen victims come in traumatized, sometimes with their children, and I highly am impressed and thankful for all the hard work that each and every one of you do. I would like to know, are you finding that victims are more apt to tell their story and not recant? It is such a sad situation, but knowing that you all are there for them is so important, and I thank you very much for that.
Thank you. That's a great question.
I think it's important to remember that when you're reporting and when you're leaving that situation, it does increase the level of the violence, the level of fear, and a lot of things that can kind of contribute to those after reporting kind of next steps.
And what research tells us is that often in situations of domestic violence, it takes up to 7 times for a victim to leave the relationship permanently. And so we know in our work that we will often work with someone who comes to us and they are making progress and doing well, and they return to their abuser. And from our perspective, we start the clock over. When we hope, they are hopeful when they go home that things will be different and that they'll be safe. And so we are also hopeful that that's the case. And when we have the opportunity, we safety plan with them before they go. And we let them know if they ever need us again that we're there. And there's no reason to be embarrassed. Come back. We start over every time, as many times as it takes. And so I, just saying that, knowing that there are people who recant, that there are people who vacate their orders of protection and those kinds of things. We get it. We get it. And I know for Rose's office, it's probably very frustrating, but they also.
I think that's the nature of this crime. It's a complicated crime. We have a lot of folks who come in and, after someone has been charged, we can't necessarily say with 100% certainty that we have protected them from the abuser. Oftentimes there's just conditions of release that are in effect for a no contact, but that doesn't mean that contact isn't happening and that the pressure isn't there and the fear isn't still there. So oftentimes we will get victims of these crimes coming in and saying, I've been told that all I have to do is tell you it didn't happen, and it didn't happen, and the case will go away. Again, we have to treat that on a case-by-case basis. I have told victims, you know what, when you were covered in blood and bruises and crying to the police officer, I actually think that might have been the truth. And oftentimes when I have that conversation with them, they will indicate something along the lines of, yeah, maybe, but I don't want this to go any further, so I'm giving you this recantation. We had a woman come in fairly recently who said, I'm giving you a recantation. You and I both know it's false, but I was told to do it so that this goes away. So in my office, we try not to have that go away. We tried to if the case can continue, we try to have the case continue and figure out if we can get to the roots of why that abuse happened. Is it alcohol? Is it violence? Is it other mental health issues that we can address? Sometimes we have to dismiss a case if there really isn't any more evidence to go forward on. But like Commander Sheldon was saying, police are doing a better job of collecting broader evidence, taking photographs, talking to witnesses who heard things, you know, hearing pounding on the walls next door, hearing someone scream, "Get off me." Sometimes when we have other evidence, even if the victim themselves doesn't want to go forward, we can still push on, and that's what we're trying to do. But you know, my prosecutors that handle these cases, it's just part of the dynamic.
And if you are a victim going through the court proceedings with Rose and her team, we're always happy to come sit with you in court also. If that can add just even the slightest layer of comfort in any way, we're happy to do that, so reach out.
All right, any other questions? Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. It was wonderful to have everybody. And thank you all for being here with us today, and let's keep doing the work.